black woman physically dragged off the plane, the airline CEO's reaction shocks everyone. Amara Johnson tugged the leather strap of her carry-on tighter over her shoulder as she stepped onto the jet bridge. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of recycled ventilation, but it wasn't just the atmosphere that felt oppressive. The unspoken tension of the moment settled on her chest, a weight she'd grown all too familiar with. She'd flown countless times before: business, pleasure, charity work. But today's flight to Chicago carried a unique importance. It wasn't just another business meeting. It was an opportunity to secure a deal that would uplift her company and create jobs for hundreds in underprivileged communities. She'd prepared for weeks, poured her soul into every detail. She needed this to go smoothly. Her heels clicked confidently against the linoleum floor as she walked down the aisle, her tailored navy suit immaculate. She'd learned early on that projecting confidence was a necessity, not a luxury. Her mother used to say, "You don't just represent yourself, Amara. You represent everyone who ever doubted someone like you could be here." As she approached her seat in first class, she caught the lingering stares. Some passengers glanced at her once and quickly looked away, feigning disinterest. Others stared longer, their eyes scanning her from head to toe, as if trying to make sense of her presence in the exclusive cabin. Amara was used to it. First class wasn't a place where people expected to see someone like her: dark skin, natural curls, and the poise of someone who belonged. But she did belong. She'd earned her way here 100 times over. Sliding her bag into the overhead compartment, Amara felt a shadow beside her. A flight attendant, blonde, mid-40s, and exuding an air of practiced politeness, stood waiting. "Can I help you with that?" the woman asked, her tone saccharine sweet but clipped at the edges. "No, thank you," Amara replied with a polite smile, her bag already secure. "I've got it." The attendant lingered for a moment, her gaze narrowing slightly, before offering a curt nod and moving on. Amara could feel the unspoken questions in the air. Did she really buy this ticket? Is she in the right place? Settling into her seat, Amara placed her laptop bag beneath the chair in front of her and exhaled. She reminded herself of the mantra she always used in these situations. Stay composed. Never let them see you sweat. The pre-flight bustle continued around her. A man in a pinstripe suit placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment with an air of entitlement, barely acknowledging her as he sat down across the aisle. Another woman with a designer scarf and a loud phone voice complained to a flight attendant about the lack of sparkling water. Amara reached for the small bottle of water left at her seat and took a slow sip, feeling the cool liquid calm her rising irritation. Just as the doors were about to close, a tall man in a rumpled blazer rushed into the cabin. He was flustered, his tie askew, and the flight attendant quickly escorted him to his seat in coach. Amara noticed the attendant's demeanor shift, smiling, accommodating as though she were genuinely eager to assist him. The contrast was glaring, but Amara forced herself to look away. Moments later, the same flight attendant returned, now holding a tray of welcome drinks. "Champagne or orange juice?" she asked, offering the options with a perfunctory smile. "Orange juice, please," Amara said. The attendant handed her the glass, but didn't meet her eyes. Amara thanked her anyway, the sharp edge of dismissal in the woman's manner cutting more deeply than she cared to admit. She sipped her juice slowly, willing herself to focus on the upcoming meeting rather than the weight of the stares or the microaggressions layered into the service. The announcement from the captain came over the intercom, his voice calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a smooth flight today. Please take your seats and prepare for takeoff." Amara placed her empty glass on the tray and pulled out her laptop, ready to review her notes one last time. But as she adjusted her seatbelt, the flight attendant returned, this time with a frown etched deeply into her features. "Ma'am," she began, her voice sharper now, "you'll need to stow your laptop until after takeoff." Amara blinked, surprised by the unnecessary sternness. "Of course," she said, her voice calm. She closed the laptop and tucked it under her seat. The attendant lingered. "Is there something else?" Amara asked, her tone still measured. "No," the woman replied, her lips pressed into a thin line. She walked away, but not before Amara caught her muttering something under her breath. Though the words were inaudible, their intent was clear. Amara straightened in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. The familiar pang of frustration bubbled beneath her composed exterior, but she reminded herself once again, "Stay composed. You have nothing to prove to anyone here." The plane's engines roared to life, and Amara closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. She didn't know then that this flight would change the course of her life and the lives of those around her forever. Amara's eyes fluttered open as the plane began its ascent, the gentle vibrations of the engine humming beneath her seat. Outside, the clouds rolled by in layers of soft white, a serene view that contrasted with the tension that lingered in her chest. She adjusted her seatbelt slightly and glanced around the cabin. The other passengers seemed settled into their routines, reading, scrolling through phones, or closing their eyes in quiet preparation for the 2-hour flight. Amara tried to do the same, willing herself to relax, but the prickling sensation of being watched refused to subside. Across the aisle, the man in the pinstripe suit had been stealing glances at her. Each time she turned her head even slightly in his direction, his eyes darted back to his magazine, the glossy pages trembling slightly in his hands. Amara sighed inwardly. She'd seen this behavior before: the curiosity, the judgment, the silent calculations about her worthiness to occupy this space. She leaned back in her seat, determined to shake off the discomfort. But no sooner had she closed her eyes than she heard the sharp click of heels approaching down the narrow aisle. It was the flight attendant, Nancy, and her presence was unmistakably charged. "Excuse me, ma'am." Nancy's voice cut through the low murmur of the cabin. Amara opened her eyes to find the woman standing over her, arms crossed tightly against her chest. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding about your meal preference." Amara frowned slightly. "I don't believe there's been a misunderstanding. I confirmed my vegetarian meal during booking." Nancy's lips curled into a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, we don't have a vegetarian option listed for you. You'll need to choose from the available options." Amara took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I see. Could you double-check the manifest? I'm certain my preference was noted." Nancy stiffened, her demeanor growing colder. "Our manifest is accurate, ma'am. You'll need to make a selection." For a moment Amara considered letting it go, choosing one of the other options and avoiding further conflict. But something about Nancy's tone, the dismissiveness in her eyes, pushed her to stand firm. "Please check again," Amara said, her voice calm but resolute. "I booked this flight well in advance, and I'm certain of my request." Nancy's eyes narrowed. The small hairs on the back of Amara's neck rose as she noticed passengers nearby glancing their way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild discomfort. Nancy huffed audibly before turning on her heel and stalking back to the galley. Amara felt a flicker of unease. The interaction, though small, had left an unpleasant taste in her mouth. She adjusted her posture, sitting straighter, and forced her attention to her laptop, which now rested on her lap. But as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The meal service began shortly after, with Nancy leading the process. She moved swiftly through the cabin, her tone noticeably warmer when addressing other passengers. When she reached Amara's row, however, her face hardened. "Chicken or fish?" Nancy asked curtly, ignoring Amara's earlier request altogether. Amara looked up, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "I'll have the vegetarian option I requested." Nancy's jaw tightened, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "As I said before, there is no vegetarian option for you. If you won't choose, I'll have to move on." Amara's fingers gripped the armrest, her patience wearing thin. But before she could respond, the man across the aisle interjected, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Maybe she just doesn't understand how things work in first class," he said, loud enough for others to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the cabin. Amara turned her head slowly, her gaze locking on the man. Her expression didn't waver, but the sting of his words settled deep. She took a measured breath, refusing to let the moment rattle her. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I also understand that it's unacceptable to deny a passenger what they've rightfully requested." Nancy's face flushed. "Ma'am, if you continue to raise your voice—" Amara blinked. "Raise my voice?" She gestured to her tone, calm and composed. "I haven't raised my voice, but I will stand up for myself." The tension in the cabin thickened, an invisible line drawn between Amara and those watching the exchange. Nancy didn't respond immediately, but the look in her eyes was enough to convey her displeasure. Without another word, she turned and stormed off toward the galley. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of subtle slights and stolen glances. Nancy returned only when necessary, her interactions with Amara curt and impersonal. The man across the aisle continued his underhanded remarks, though Amara ignored him with practiced ease. But as the plane descended toward Chicago, Amara felt the weight of the experience settle over her. She had held her ground, yes, but at what cost? The humiliation, the quiet hostility, it clung to her like a shadow, a reminder of how much further the world still had to go. As the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate, Amara gathered her belongings with methodical precision. She didn't know what awaited her once she stepped off the aircraft, but a part of her sensed that the events of this flight were far from over. The plane had come to a full stop, and the familiar chime signaling passengers to disembark echoed through the cabin. Amara remained seated, her fingers brushing the strap of her laptop bag, waiting for the first wave of passengers to clear the aisle. Despite her calm exterior, the knot of tension in her chest had tightened. She glanced at her watch. It was 4:27 p.m. Enough time to make her meeting, provided there were no delays getting off the plane. The flight attendant, Nancy, was back at the front of the cabin, her voice overly cheerful as she directed passengers. It was a marked contrast to her behavior during the flight, and Amara couldn't help but notice how easily the woman's demeanor shifted depending on who she was addressing. A reminder of the unspoken rules Amara had spent her life navigating. "Thank you for flying with us," Nancy said to an elderly couple, her smile wide and bright. When her eyes briefly met Amara's, the warmth disappeared, replaced by a flicker of something colder, dismissive, almost defiant. Amara inhaled deeply, rising from her seat with deliberate movements. She didn't want to stay longer than necessary, but she also refused to let anyone rush her. As she reached for her carry-on, she heard a voice behind her, sharp and clipped. "Excuse me," a man said, his tone impatient. It was the passenger from across the aisle, the one who had made the earlier comment about her understanding of first class. He gestured toward the aisle, his gaze pointedly avoiding hers. "Some of us have places to be." Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she carefully adjusted her bag and stepped aside, granting him access to the aisle. He brushed past her without so much as a thank you, his shoulder grazing hers with unnecessary force. "Stay composed," she reminded herself. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you rattled." But as she stepped into the aisle and began making her way toward the exit, the air in the cabin seemed to shift. A faint murmuring rose behind her, low enough to be indistinct, but loud enough to carry an undertone of discontent. Amara ignored it, focusing instead on the exit door and the jet bridge beyond. As she approached the threshold, Nancy intercepted her with a raised hand. "Ma'am," she said, her voice devoid of the saccharine tone she'd used earlier with other passengers. "We need to have a word before you disembark." Amara blinked, caught off guard. "A word about what?" Nancy's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your behavior during the flight. There were multiple complaints from passengers about your tone and attitude toward the crew." Amara's chest tightened, the knot of tension threatening to unravel into something sharper. "Complaints?" she repeated, her voice steady but laced with incredulity. "I asked for my meal preference to be honored and spoke up when I felt I was being treated unfairly. How is that grounds for a complaint? Nancy crossed her arms, her posture rigid. Your attitude was disruptive, and your refusal to comply with crew instructions created unnecessary tension. The words hit Amara like a slap, each one carefully chosen to shift blame onto her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. I complied with every instruction given to me, Amara said, her voice low but firm. And I will not stand here and let you twist the narrative to paint me as the problem. Nancy's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of surprise at Amara's resolve. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Is there an issue here? It was the pilot, a tall man with graying hair and an air of authority. His presence seemed to embolden Nancy, who turned to him with a quick nod. This passenger, she began, gesturing toward Amara, was confrontational during the flight and refused to follow instructions. We need to report this. Amara's jaw tightened. That's not true, and you know it, she said, her composure beginning to crack. I was treated unfairly by your crew, and now you're trying to deflect accountability by making me the scapegoat. The pilot frowned, his eyes shifting between Nancy and Amara. Let's handle this calmly, he said, his tone measured. Ma'am, if you could step aside so we can sort this out. No, Amara said, her voice cutting through the rising tension. She straightened her posture, the full weight of her dignity and presence filling the small space. I'm not stepping aside because I've done nothing wrong. If you want to report me, you'll need to explain exactly what I did that warrants it, and I suggest you be very specific. A hush fell over the nearby passengers, many of whom had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. Nancy opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The pilot shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for Amara's unyielding stance. The moment stretched, heavy and charged, until another figure emerged from the galley, a younger flight attendant, her expression tense but determined. Excuse me, she said, addressing the pilot directly. I was there during the entire flight, and I don't believe Ms. Johnson did anything wrong. In fact, she was remarkably calm given the circumstances. Nancy's head snapped toward the younger woman, her expression a mixture of shock and indignation. Mia, she hissed, this isn't your place. It is my place, Mia said firmly, her gaze steady. I watched what happened. Ms. Johnson requested her meal preference, and she was polite the entire time. Any tension was caused by how she was treated, not by her actions. Amara's chest swelled with a mix of relief and gratitude, though she kept her expression neutral. Nancy, on the other hand, looked as though she'd been struck. The pilot cleared his throat, clearly eager to defuse the situation. We'll conduct an internal review of this matter, he said, his tone dismissive. For now, let's not hold up the other passengers. Nancy opened her mouth to protest, but the pilot shot her a warning look. Reluctantly, she stepped aside, allowing Amara to continue toward the exit. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, her head held high, she knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal, but it was a victory, however small. The stares, the whispers, the injustice, all of it lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. But as Amara walked away from the plane, she carried something else with her. A quiet, unshakable determination to ensure that this moment would not be forgotten. The jet bridge was colder than Amara expected, the artificial chill biting at her skin as she stepped into the terminal. Around her, other passengers bustled toward baggage claim and connecting flights, their movements hurried and indifferent. She adjusted her carry-on strap, her mind still replaying the confrontation with Nancy. It wasn't the first time Amara had faced situations like this, but the sting never dulled. It wasn't just the public humiliation, it was the weight of being seen as the problem when she had done nothing wrong. Her every move, every word, had been dissected, twisted into a justification for mistreatment. The crowd thinned as Amara walked toward the exit. A quiet space ahead offered a reprieve, a chance to gather herself before calling for a car to her hotel. She found a bench near the large glass windows overlooking the tarmac and sat down, her hands resting on her lap. For the first time since the flight began, she allowed herself a moment to feel. The tension in her shoulders released in a slow, trembling exhale. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as her mind churned. She wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would come later, once the shock wore off. Right now, she felt raw, exposed, as though every person who had watched her on that plane had left behind an invisible mark. Why is it always like this? The question came unbidden, bitter and familiar. Amara had spent years perfecting the art of composure, of maintaining a veneer of calm, no matter the provocation. But moments like this chipped away at that armor, each experience leaving behind a scar. "Excuse me." The voice startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Amara looked up to see a young woman standing a few feet away, her expression hesitant but kind. She recognized her immediately, Mia, the flight attendant who had spoken up on her behalf. "Hi," Amara said, her voice soft but wary. "Can I help you?" Mia glanced around as if making sure no one was watching, before taking a cautious step closer. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened on the flight. It wasn't right, and I thought you should know that." Amara studied her for a moment, the sincerity in her eyes easing some of the tension in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you speaking up. That couldn't have been easy." Mia shook her head, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It wasn't, but it was the right thing to do. Nancy, she has a history of treating certain passengers unfairly, but no one ever says anything because she's been with the airline for so long." The words hit Amara like a slap. A history. That meant this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one that had likely gone unchecked for years. "Has anyone reported her?" Amara asked, her voice sharper now. Mia hesitated. "Not officially. People are afraid of retaliation. She's close with some of the senior staff and, well, you saw how she acts. She knows how to protect herself." Amara's jaw tightened. The knot in her chest was back, but this time it burned with something fiercer than before. "Thank you for telling me," she said, her voice firm. "And thank you for standing up for me. It means more than you know." Mia nodded, her expression softening. "You deserved better. I'm sorry you didn't get it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Amara alone once more. The terminal buzzed faintly around her, a backdrop to the storm brewing in her mind. Amara pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with purpose as she searched for the airline's customer service line. She wasn't sure what she expected, an apology perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement of what had happened, but as the automated system directed her call, her resolve hardened. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for anyone who had been treated like she had, anyone who hadn't had the voice or the opportunity to fight back. After several minutes on hold, a representative answered, their tone overly cheerful. "Thank you for calling Skyway Airlines. How can I assist you today?" Amara took a steadying breath. "I need to file a formal complaint about the treatment I received on Flight 476 from New York to Chicago." The representative paused, their tone shifting slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Could you provide some details about the incident?" Amara recounted the events slowly, methodically, her voice measured but firm. She described Nancy's dismissive behavior, the false accusations, and the humiliation she'd endured. The representative listened quietly, occasionally murmuring words of acknowledgement. When she finished, there was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "We take these matters very seriously," the representative said finally. "Your complaint will be forwarded to our management team for review. Someone will be in touch with you within 48 hours. "Thank you," Amara said, though the words felt hollow. She ended the call and stared at her phone, the knot in her chest refusing to loosen. As she stood and made her way toward the exit, a thought struck her. She had been calm, measured, and respectful in her complaint, just as she had been on the flight. But where had that gotten her? Would anything truly change, or would her words be swept under the rug like so many others before her? The anger she'd been holding back began to simmer, a quiet but potent flame. Amara had spent her life playing by the rules, trusting that fairness would prevail. But fairness wasn't something that came easily, not when systems were designed to protect those in power. By the time she stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air, her resolve was clear. She wasn't going to let this go, not this time. Amara stood on the curb outside the terminal, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her blazer. The skyline of Chicago loomed in the distance, a cold steel grey against the fading sunlight. Cars rushed by, horns honking intermittently, but the chaos of the city barely registered in her mind. Her grip tightened around the handle of her carry-on as she gazed ahead, her thoughts churning. She felt the weight of the day pressing on her like a heavy stone, the humiliation on the flight, the stares, the smug remarks, and finally, Nancy's audacious attempt to paint her as the aggressor. It all played in a loop in her head. Amara had long since learned how to process such moments, to compartmentalize and move forward. But this time, it felt different. This time, the wound wasn't closing. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. It was a notification from one of her professional group chats. Messages zipped by, each one a reminder of the critical meeting she was supposed to be preparing for. Amara hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then, almost impulsively, she slid the phone back into her pocket. The meeting could wait. Amara flagged a car and slid into the back seat, her voice steady as she gave the driver the address to her hotel. As the car pulled away from the curb, the familiar sensation of resolve began to take hold. She wasn't just going to file a complaint and hope for a hollow apology. She was going to ensure that this didn't happen again, not to her, and not to anyone else. The ride to the hotel was quiet, the muted sound of the city creating a soothing backdrop as Amara's thoughts coalesced. By the time the car pulled up to the sleek glass facade of the boutique hotel, she had already begun to formulate a plan. She thanked the driver, retrieved her bag, and stepped into the lobby. The warmth of the space was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Polished floors gleamed under soft lighting, and a faint scent of lavender hung in the air. Amara checked in quickly, her interactions with the staff efficient but polite. She could feel their eyes on her, likely assessing her as people often did, but after the day she'd had, she didn't have the energy to care. Her room was on the 12th floor, a quiet sanctuary overlooking the bustling streets below. Amara set her bag down by the window and let out a slow breath, the day's events settling over her like a heavy cloak. She walked to the desk and pulled out her laptop, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. What was the best way to begin? Her instinct told her that filing a complaint through the airline's official channels wouldn't be enough. She needed to go higher, directly to the top. Amara spent the next 2 hours researching everything she could about Skyway Airlines. She combed through their corporate website, scrutinizing the executive leadership page, memorizing names and faces. Richard Hale, the CEO, caught her attention immediately. He was a no-nonsense man with a reputation for valuing innovation and customer satisfaction. His interviews revealed a charismatic leader who claimed to care deeply about inclusivity and fairness. "Let's see if you live up to your words," she thought, her fingers typing faster. Amara drafted a detailed email addressed directly to Hale, bypassing the customer service team entirely. She outlined every aspect of her experience with precision, describing not just the actions of the crew, but also the broader implications of allowing such behavior to persist. She wrote about the silence of the other passengers, the fear in Mia's voice when she had spoken up, and the systemic nature of the issue. She ended the email with a firm but respectful demand, an acknowledgement of the incident, a commitment to investigate, and meaningful changes to prevent such incidents in the future. Her final sentence was direct and uncompromising. "I will not remain silent in the face of injustice. I hope Skyway Airlines will not either." When the email was finally sent, Amara leaned back in her chair, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind alight with determination. She stared out the window at the city below, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The world outside seemed vast and indifferent, but Amara knew better than to underestimate her own voice. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she didn't hesitate to check it. It was a text from her assistant, Vanessa. "How was the flight? Are you ready for tomorrow's meeting?" Amara stared at the message for a moment before typing a response. "The flight was eventful. Let's talk tomorrow after the meeting. I'll need your help with something big." She hit send and set the phone down, her thoughts already racing ahead. She wasn't naive enough to think that one email would change everything, but it was a spark that she intended to fan into a flame. Amara didn't sleep much that night. Her mind replayed the moments on the flight, the look on Nancy's face as she tried to assert her power, the whispers of the passengers who had watched in silence. Each memory fueled her resolve. She thought about Mia, the young flight attendant who had risked her position to stand up for what was right. Amara couldn't let that courage go to waste. By dawn, she had a plan. The meeting she had traveled for was still important, but it would no longer be the sole focus of her trip. Amara was determined to hold Skyway Airlines accountable not just for her experience, but for the unspoken patterns of discrimination that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the first light of morning spilled through the window, Amara stood by the desk, her silhouette sharp against the rising sun. She didn't know how this journey would end, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't back down. Not now, and not ever. The morning arrived slowly, the pale sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains and casting soft shadows on the walls. Amara had been awake for hours, her mind buzzing with the weight of her plans and the meeting she needed to attend. Though her fight with Skyway Airlines was now at the forefront of her thoughts, she couldn't neglect the business opportunity that had brought her to Chicago in the first place. She moved methodically as she prepared, her every action deliberate. Her outfit, a sleek charcoal pantsuit paired with a muted silk blouse, was chosen not just for its professional appearance, but for the armor it provided. In a world where perception often outweighed merit, her presentation had to be impeccable. Amara stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer. She met her own gaze, her reflection steady, composed, but carrying the faintest trace of weariness. She smoothed a strand of her hair and whispered to herself, "You've got this." The meeting was being held at a towering glass building in the heart of downtown Chicago, the kind of structure that seemed designed to intimidate. Amara walked through the revolving doors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor, her posture tall and confident. The receptionist greeted her with a professional smile. "Welcome to Finley Enterprises. Your meeting is on the 25th floor, Miss Johnson." "Thank you," Amara replied, her tone polite but distant. She stepped into the elevator, the quiet hum of the machinery filling the small space as she ascended. By the time the elevator doors slid open, Amara's mind was fully focused. The weight of the previous day lingered, but she had compartmentalized it, locking it away for now. Today's meeting wasn't just about securing a deal, it was about proving once again that she belonged in rooms like this. Inside the conference room, a group of executives sat around a long, sleek table. Their chatter quieted as Amara entered, their eyes turning toward her with varying degrees of interest. She recognized the subtle dynamics at play, the quick glances, the small nods, the unspoken questions about whether she truly deserved a seat at this table. She ignored them. "Mrs. Johnson," said Martin Finley, the CEO of Finley Enterprises, rising from his chair to greet her. He was a tall man with sharp features and a voice that carried authority. "We're excited to have you here today." Amara extended her hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Finley. I've been looking forward to this discussion." They exchanged pleasantries before taking their seats, and the meeting began. Amara presented her proposal with precision and clarity, her voice steady as she outlined the benefits of the partnership. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent years mastering her craft. her every word calculated to convey not just competence, but vision. The room was silent as she finished, the weight of her presentation settling over the table. Then, slowly, the questions began. Some were sharp, probing, designed to test her resolve. Others were softer, curious, as though the executives were beginning to see her not just as a businesswoman, but as a potential ally. Amara answered each question with the same calm assurance she had carried throughout the presentation. By the time the meeting concluded, she could see the shift in their expressions, the respect that had begun to take root. As the room emptied, Martin lingered, his sharp eyes studying her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "You're impressive, Miss Johnson," he said, his tone warm but thoughtful. "I don't say that lightly." Amara inclined her head, her lips curving into a small smile. "I appreciate that, Mr. Finley. I believe in what I do, and I believe in the value of this partnership." He nodded, then paused, as though considering his next words. "You carry yourself with a quiet strength," he said. "That's rare in this industry." Amara met his gaze, her voice steady as she replied, "Strength isn't something I've had the luxury to go without, Mr. Finley." The weight of her words hung in the air, unspoken, but understood. Martin gave her a small, knowing nod before extending his hand. "We'll be in touch soon. I think this could be the start of something great." Amara left the building with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The meeting had gone well, and though there were no guarantees, she felt confident in the outcome. But as she stepped out onto the bustling street, the knot in her chest returned, a reminder of the other battle she was fighting. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her emails as she walked. A new message from Skyway Airlines caught her eye, its subject line simple but promising: "Response to your recent experience." Amara hesitated for a moment before opening it, her pulse quickening as her eyes scanned the text. The email was formal, apologetic, but vague. It acknowledged her complaint and promised an investigation, but it lacked any tangible commitment to change. There was no mention of the specific crew members involved or the steps the airline planned to take. Amara's jaw tightened. She had expected as much, but the dismissiveness of the response still stung. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, the city's noise fading into the background as her resolve hardened. This isn't over, she thought, her grip on the phone tightening, not by a long shot. That evening, as she sat in her hotel room, Amara began drafting her next move. She reached out to contacts, colleagues and friends, gathering resources and advice. She knew this wasn't a battle she could fight alone, but she also knew she wasn't the only one who had faced such treatment. The anger she had kept at bay began to take shape, not as rage, but as determination. Amara wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had been dismissed, humiliated, or made to feel small. As the city lights glittered outside her window, Amara worked late into the night, her focus unshakable. The fight ahead would be long, but she was ready. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she saw real, lasting change. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, gently waking Amara from a restless sleep. She opened her eyes, the weight of the previous day still pressing on her mind. Yet, today, that weight didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt like fuel, an energy that propelled her forward. Amara picked up her phone. A new notification flashed on the screen: Skyway Airlines issues official statement. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the post. The first few lines made her heart beat faster. Skyway Airlines deeply apologizes for the unacceptable experience of passenger Amara Johnson on Flight 476. We are committed to making meaningful changes to create a fair and respectful environment for all our customers. While the statement felt carefully worded and diplomatic, Amara recognized it as a crucial first step. Satisfaction flickered in her chest, but she didn't allow it to linger. Words without actions were meaningless. After reading the statement, Amara decided to call Vanessa. "Vanessa, I want us to keep a close eye on this. I need to ensure that this isn't just a hollow apology, but the beginning of real change. Reach out to a few consumer rights organizations and propose partnering with them to monitor Skyway's process. Vanessa responded immediately. I've been thinking the same thing. I also received an email this morning from a lawyer who's interested in collaborating with us. He believes this case could set a precedent and put pressure on other airlines. Amara smiled. That's excellent. Let's schedule a meeting. We need to outline a long-term strategy. That afternoon, Amara sat in her temporary hotel office, a list of goals spread out before her. She didn't just want to improve Skyway Airlines, she wanted to challenge the entire service industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. She had already reached out to activists, diversity training experts, and consumer advocacy organizations. One name on her list made her pause. Mia Carter, the flight attendant who had stood up for her. Amara picked up the phone and dialed Mia directly. "Hello, Ms. Carter," Amara said when the other line picked up. "This is Amara Johnson." "Ms. Johnson," Mia responded, her voice tinged with surprise but steady. "It's an honor to hear from you. I wanted to thank you again for standing up for me in such a difficult moment," Amara said. "But I also wanted to ask if you'd consider joining me in this fight. I'm working with several organizations to push for changes in the airline industry. With your experience, you could help us understand what needs to change from the inside." There was a brief silence before Mia replied, her voice resolute. "I'm deeply honored by your trust, and I'll join you. This is something that needs to happen." That evening, Amara stood by her hotel window, gazing at the glittering city lights against the dark sky. Thoughts of the future swirled in her mind. This wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had been dismissed, discriminated against, or made to feel invisible. She opened her laptop and added a new line to her growing list of objectives. Not just Skyway Airlines transform the entire airline industry. Amara smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. The following morning, Amara awoke with a clear sense of purpose. The fog of uncertainty that had lingered the day before had lifted, replaced by a sharp focus. She reviewed the progress she'd made the previous night, emails sent, calls made, and a growing network of allies who were willing to back her. If Skyway Airlines thought they could sweep this incident under the rug, they were sorely mistaken. Amara's phone buzzed on the desk. It was Vanessa, her assistant. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," Vanessa said, her voice bright and eager. "Just wanted to let you know everything is in place for your follow-up call with Skyway Airlines. I also reached out to the journalist from the Post who covered the airline's last controversy. She's interested in hearing your story." "Perfect," Amara replied. "Let's keep the momentum going." Vanessa hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go this public? It could get messy." Amara's voice was steady, unyielding. "It's already messy, Vanessa. The only difference now is that they'll be held accountable." By noon, Amara was seated in her hotel room with her laptop open, ready for the video call with Skyway's senior leadership. She adjusted the camera angle, ensuring her expression projected calm confidence. She wasn't nervous, she was prepared. The screen blinked, and the faces of 3 executives appeared. In the center was Richard Hale, the CEO. His image was sharp and polished, his presence commanding. He greeted her with a perfunctory smile. "Ms. Johnson," Hale began, his tone cordial but distant, "thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We've reviewed your concerns, and we'd like to discuss how we can address them." Amara leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. Before we begin, I want to make it clear that this isn't just about addressing my personal experience. This is about addressing the culture within your airline that allows such behavior to persist." Hale blinked, momentarily taken aback by her directness. "Of course," he said, recovering quickly. "We take these matters seriously, and we're committed to ensuring all passengers feel respected and valued." "Then why did your initial response feel like a generic form letter?" Amara countered, her voice calm but pointed. "There was no acknowledgement of the specific behavior of your staff, no outlined plan for corrective action. It felt dismissive." The other executives shifted uncomfortably, their expressions tight. Hale's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I understand your frustration," he said. "We've already taken steps to investigate the incident and have placed the involved staff on leave pending the outcome." Amara's eyes narrowed. "And what about the systemic issues that allowed this to happen? What are you doing to ensure this doesn't happen again to me or anyone else?" The conversation continued, with Amara refusing to back down. She pressed for specific commitments, mandatory inclusivity training, transparent reporting of discriminatory incidents, and a public acknowledgement of the harm caused by their policies. By the end of the call, Hale looked visibly unsettled, but he agreed to her demands, promising to issue a formal statement within 48 hours. 2 days later, Amara sat in her office, watching as the airline's official statement went live. Hale's voice was measured and somber as he addressed the public. "At Skyway Airlines, we strive to create an environment where all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. We failed to uphold that standard in the case of Mrs. Amara Johnson, and for that we deeply apologize. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory inclusivity training for all staff and establishing a passenger advocacy committee chaired by Ms. Johnson herself." Amara leaned back in her chair, a mix of satisfaction and relief washing over her. It wasn't perfect, no single victory ever was, but it was a step forward. Her phone buzzed with a flood of messages, friends, colleagues, even strangers who had seen the statement and reached out with words of support. Among them was a text from Mia, the flight attendant who had stood up for her. "Thank you for fighting. You've inspired me to do the same." Amara smiled, her resolve strengthened. The fight wasn't over, but she had proven something important. That even in the face of systemic injustice, one voice, steady and unyielding, could spark change. As the sun set outside her window, Amara closed her laptop and gazed at the horizon. Her journey was far from finished, but she was ready for whatever came next. With each step forward, she knew she was paving the way for a world where no one would have to endure what she had. And that, she thought, was a fight worth continuing. This story is a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right can spark change far beyond what we imagine. It shows the strength of resilience and the impact of holding those in power accountable. If you believe in the power of stories like this to inspire and create change, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Join our community where we uncover stories that matter and shed light on the truth. Thank you for watching, and I can't wait to share more with you next time.